After Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib rejected Israel's offer to let her visit her grandmother in the occupied West Bank, President Trump took to Twitter late Friday, suggesting Tlaib was only out to make Israel look bad. Permission was quickly granted, whereupon Tlaib obnoxiously turned the approval down. A complete setup. The only real winner here is Tlaib's grandmother. She doesn't have to see her now. After she was first barred, Tlaib appealed to the Israeli government, citing her grandmother's age, 90, and suggesting that there may not be many more chances to see her. The Israelis relented, but their offer came with strings attached. While there, Tlaib, a critic of Israel's treatment of Palestinians, would not be allowed to promote an international movement to boycott Israel. After initially agreeing, Tlaib decided it wasn't worth it, writing, "I have decided that visiting my grandmother under these oppressive conditions stands against everything I believe in, and that would break my grandmother's heart." This, as NBC News has confirmed. President Trump has talked to aides and members of Congress about possibly buying Greenland. The massive, resource-rich island is home to a U.S. military base and 56,000 citizens living in what is an autonomous part of Denmark, whose former prime minister mocked the idea, calling it an April Fool's joke, as many Greenlanders rejected it outright.
It feels as if he's very patronizing. It doesn't feel like he understands like the reality, and it's stupid.